the Policy Foundation for India's digital media and entertainment sector. For this interesting panel, we have some very respected panelists. For the same, I would like to introduce our moderator, Mr. Shashi Shekhar Vempati. He's a technocrat and leader in the media technology space, ex-CEO for Prasar Bharati. Welcome, sir, on stage. We will have Mr. Vikram Sahay joining us in a while. Meanwhile, I would like to introduce Mr. Mihir Rale, Chief Regional Counsel from Disney Star. Welcome, sir, on stage. We will also have Mr. Ritesh Khosla, Deputy General Counsel and Head Standards and Practices, Sony Pictures Network India, joining us virtually on the screen. He would be joining in, I think, in next 30 seconds. And Mr. Sahay will join us in another 10 minutes of time. Meanwhile, I'll request Mr. Shashi to start this session, please.
Thank you. Very happy to be here. And I think, as you rightly pointed out, it's the topic of the session is something that's been discussed, debated. Perhaps every day we see something in the news, online, in social media, laying the policy foundations for India's digital media and entertainment sector. If I recall, a lot of what we are seeing today in terms of the regulatory framework originated about 2.5 years back, right, around the time the COVID pandemic, and a lot of concerns around content, concerns around fake news. And then you had this series of amendments to the IT rules. But then there are other dimensions of policy and regulation, which perhaps require us to relook at some of the old laws and put in place very progressive kind of foundation for how we are going to govern this sector. So that's where you have the data protection draft bill that has been circulated. There is also talk of Digital India Act. In fact, I wonder, can we actually design laws that will keep pace with technology? Because just looking at how ChatGPT in the last few months has completely revolutionized how content can be created. It's no longer about content and platforms. I think it is also about content, platforms, and who's doing it, whether it's a human or an algorithm, and what are the issues around it. So clearly the policy foundation will have to have a much long-term view in terms of how these issues will be tackled. So while we wait to hear the government's side, perhaps you could start with what challenges you're seeing within your platforms, broader industry, and more importantly, what lessons should we learn from other countries, because Disney has such a wide footprint across the globe. So what global lessons from a policy standpoint should India be taking from?
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm grateful to be here. I think it's an opportune time, as we were speaking earlier also. I think it's great that we finally have a situation where we're starting to relook at laws. I think a lot of the laws have lived their life potentially, and you essentially end up then kind of leaving it to courts to figure out ways to interpret for a contemporaneous kind of interpretation. So it's a great time that we're doing this. It's the right thing to do. I mean, just off the top of my head, since we spoke about the telecommunications bill or the Digital India Act or data privacy, I think many questions to be deliberated on there. From a global standpoint, though, one thing that immediately occurs to me, because that was your question, was the speed at which a lot of regulation making happens. And while I think speed is important, speed actually sometimes is the best way you can push things through, given how the political ecosystem and how things actually evolve and move. But a lot of deliberation must be gone into. And the reason I say so is you're essentially laying the foundation for something that you hope is going to serve the country for maybe the next 50 plus years. In which space, I think the level of deliberation definitely needs to go into. Otherwise, I mean, just off the top of my head, I'll just give you an example. A lot of what we talk about is same service, same rules. And I'll give a very, base example, which actually someone in my team has given, which I love to quote when given the opportunity, is that earlier travel was, You would do it by bullock cart, then by cycle, then by motorcycle, then by train, and then eventually by plane. But would you essentially consider it to be, something that can actually be compared? So in the same space, while you may be delivering the same content, uh, the technology that goes into it, the manner of how that technology is consumed, become equally important parameters basis which a lot of differentiation must be evolved. Not least because it's innovation at the core of it. I mean, if we step back and think of it, we're all competing for what? On a very macro level, we're actually competing for people's time. When we try and get people to actually consume our services, we're trying to compete for their time. But as you dig deeper, the reason why a lot of intervention happens only when there's exact substitutability is because you leave the space available for people to innovate outside of that exact substitutability factor in a specific market. So I think a lot of these factors important, require deliberation. So the first key call out I would have in terms of what actually needs to be done is there has to be sufficient deliberation, it has to be well thought out, and it has to outlive all of us.
Very aptly put, that it has to outlive all of us. When I look at the Telegraph Act, which has lasted in India for more than a century, and then finally now we have a new telecom bill that is perhaps going to replace it. So clearly, when we make laws and policies, that is something that should definitely be kept in mind. Often I've noticed that several policies or regulatory frameworks, the thought process is how do we control something, right? I mean, that is one objective, right? How do I control fake news? How do I, control content which is not, inappropriate, and so on. But what about the positive factors, right? What kind of outcomes from an industry standpoint or a sector standpoint that you think the policy framework should have so that those goals are met or those objectives are met? So from that standpoint, what do you think India should be doing that will ensure that this sector, becomes a job creator, for example, it becomes a global powerhouse of content and innovation? Right?
Thank you. If you ask me what should we be doing from a content standpoint, I'm a big, sorry, but I'm going to repeat myself on this topic, but I'm a big believer in the notion of freedom of speech. And I think it makes a big statement about how we perceive ourselves and the maturity that we actually believe we're capable of. The more intervention into what someone can consume, sitting at home, sitting anywhere else, my sense is you're essentially saying we don't trust you to make a choice for yourself as to what content you can consume. So therefore, just the notions that, and we're already living through it if you think of it, the notions that the same rule should apply when it comes to content which is displayed in a theater, which you consume with members of the public, which you would need to also follow the same rules when it comes to watching it at home, whether it's by linear broadcast or by non-linear broadcast. To me, these are notions which are very antiquated. If you can trust people beyond the point to make the right choice in terms of the people they vote for, surely they have the ability to determine what content they would be okay with consuming in the privacy of their homes. I mean, let's change a channel. If you don't like it, change a channel. Plus, it's an active choice and an ability. So I think a lot of this makes a difference in terms of the positive reinforcements. And I think, India is poised to actually sort of take up that mantle. We feel very, self-assured now of ourselves. I think in multiple forums, on multiple stadia, we're actually sort of becoming a nation that people look to. It's about time that we felt and behaved like we have the confidence in our people as well to make the choices for themselves, especially when it comes to content. There's a reason why I suppose our constitution makers chose to keep intrusion into free speech to a very limited set of grounds.
Very interesting that you bring up, freedom of speech and trusting viewers to decide what is appropriate, what they should watch. Do we have Mr. Khosla online? Mr. Khosla, can you hear us? He's on mute.
Now it seems like there are technical issues.
Can you hear us?
I can.
Yeah, okay, great. Thanks for joining us online. So we just kicked off the discussion here. This is Shashi Shekhar here. We're still waiting for Mr. Sahay to join us. So the discussion so far has been on, what is the lessons that India should learn in terms of policy and regulating the content and media entertainment sector digitally, and also on the kind of outcomes that we desire from a policy standpoint. So perhaps you could give your perspective in terms of how do you see the experience or the journey so far, since India has put in place this content regulatory framework for digital over the last couple of years. So what is your assessment of what has happened so far, and what issues do you see from an industry standpoint?
Thank you. I hope I continue to remain audible. It's a very interesting question. First, I must thank IMI and yourself for giving me this opportunity to join this discussion. This topic is quite interesting, and the question is all the more interesting. I've been in this industry for now close to 15 years, and I think the last 5-7 years have been a game changer for the entire industry, both for linear and for digital. And digital is slowly, I'm not going to quote any figures and empirical data, how digital is becoming increasingly more important, not only from content perspective, but for the various possibilities that this platform offers. Now, what has been happening is, in my view, that as the proliferation of digital media is happening, the government has been taking proactive but sadly ad hoc measures to regulate some of the segments of the digital media, be it on the content side or the technology side or the distribution side, or the newer forms of digital media like gaming, which is coming up, or the NFTs, which where the discussion has been happening. And at the same time, while looking at the segmentation of the digital media, there have been serious conversations happening under the Indian Telecom Bill, which is going to, uh, for the lack of better word, going to impact a lot of digital media, including the OTTs. And the way the content is offered and at what price point, this bill is likely to determine if it is presented in its current form and is passed. Uh, MIB has been taking initiatives in its own domain on self-regulation of content, which is a welcome thing. TRI has been trying to enter the distribution of the OTT. It has been softly, directly, indirectly, actively, passively been looking at the distribution. So what I have seen over the years is that with the growth of the digital media as we witness, there has been fragmentation of the segments which the government wants to regulate softly or more aggressively. TRI on the distribution side, Mateys on the technology side, MIB on the content side, and then we have got draft telecom bill on the anvil. And then we also hear about the Digital Media Act, on which Mr. Rajiv Chandrasekhar, Minister of State, made a statement that everything will be brought under the umbrella, which is a welcome thing. But there seem to be problems. We haven't seen the text. So the point that I want to drive and conclude is that the laying of foundation for any important sector of any economy will require a lot of discussion with the stakeholders. Amongst the stakeholders within the government, MATI, MIB, TRI, as to who will regulate what part and whether it is counterproductive to have so many ministries and so many allocation of business rules within the government. Is that the best way forward? Or we continue with this soft, or in certain cases, aggressive segmentation of regulation within the same broader media industry, and then eventually bring it under one umbrella so that eventually this business growth is not impacted.
I hear what you're saying, that we may have too many regulators or too many entities within the government that are trying to regulate the sector, and that poses issues and challenges. So perhaps you could maybe think ahead, look ahead, and give us your sense of what is the ideal regulatory framework that you would want, the industry would want.
I think that, I think it's a bit late, because the jurisdiction of the various segments of the digital media have been claimed. To say that MeitY will not regulate the technology is now a far-fetched in my view. You can't usurp now MeitY's jurisdiction. You can't usurp MIB's jurisdiction. So as a Reserve Bank of India regulations play a very a deep-rooted role in the digital payment landscape, and that cuts its path with the OTTs as well, who I represent. And then we have got the data protection bill coming in. Then we have got ASK, which self-regulates. So I think the ideal way, the long and short of it, is to bring everything under one common umbrella, so that the digital media players do not have to deal with multiple regulations, or regulators rather. Regulation will continue to be there, but multiple regulators. And I think Digital Media Act could be the right opportunity for the government to execute it in such a way that whatever the vision and the policy foundation that the government wants to lay down, it is well executed and well articulated in the Digital Media Act, the text of which I don't think anybody has seen, but it sounds just right, that everything comes under it. MeitY may have its jurisdiction on technology, but at the end of the day, there is one single window or one single statute under which I will be covered. Could be the best way forward given the circumstances that have evolved over the years.
So Mihir, what is your take on this? What is the ideal regulatory setup? Should it be one umbrella within which everything should be there, or a soft approach but multiple jurisdictions? What is the right way to do?
Yeah, so since you mentioned ideal framework, I'm assuming it's a blank parchment sheet on which I can draw. So you don't have the government here. I've been I've been waiting. But no, in that space, I think interesting that you raised the question. But on that blank.
You can still speak your mind.
No, but on that blank parchment, so just to recap, the question is, what is the ideal framework potentially from a content standpoint that you can think of in a digital media space? But essentially on that blank parchment sheet, to my mind, I think two things, right? One is, I think people use the term convergence too easily now. I don't think everything is so easily converged. To my mind, there are bright lines around technology right from inception, which is from where the content actually goes from the creator right up to the end consumer. And there are bright lines that can be drawn there. But outside of that, very macro, I would talk about at least content and carriage being kept separate. I understand there are elements of carriage where infrastructure is primarily used for content dissemination, where there may be overlap, or where you may be straddling both, carriage and content. But given that that infrastructure is primarily designed to cater for content, I would assume that it could fall within one particular umbrella. I'm not going to name an umbrella or whatever else it may be. But to my mind, in that space, I think let's do away with the word convergence where it's not required. It's just an easy term if you can't really distill. And I think there are very clear ways by which you can distill. But within the larger space, keep carriage and content separate. Their parameters are different, their constitutional origins are different, their reasons for getting into regulating it are very different. So let's keep those two different. That would be just broadly an ideal framework or, sort of starting point to my mind.
Great. So welcome, Mr. Sahay. We also have Mr. Ritesh Khosla online, who's joined us. He's from Sony. So maybe you could
Sahay,
give
how are
us maybe look back at the journey, right? How did the government go about trying to regulate this very nascent sector? What has been the experience? What are the lessons learned? And what is the way forward in terms of how digital media and entertainment should be, regulated in India?
Thank you so much, and again, my apologies for joining very late. Well, the 2 years since the rules came into being, now we are in February, so on 25th February 21, we had these rules. And one can draw large satisfaction in terms of, if you look at the type of thinking which is happening in the sector, there were a lot of apprehensions in terms of what will actually government do. And prior to 2021, we had rounds of consultations with IMAI itself. In 2019, 2020, we had consultations in Chennai, in Bombay, in Delhi. And in fact, they were given the first sort of hand in terms of preparing a self-regulating mechanism. They came out with something, but somehow there were some issues. And then the government had to step in and we came up with these regulations. But the large apprehensions which were there, that come a regulation and the content entire scenario will get stifled. That never happened. In fact, that got encouraged. And if you talk to the large number of OTT players who we interact informally with and also at forums, they feel the overall three-tier co-regulatory mechanism which is there is working quite robustly. And I can share that in the last 2 years, the robustness of the system is such that we in the ministry have not received a single complaint escalated from the second tier, which means that the first tier and the second tier have been working in a very disciplined, very responsible fashion. So that is kudos to the co-regulatory structure, I would put it that way. But you see, it is important for the oversight mechanism to be there because from the perspective of the citizens, they feel government has to be there. Government cannot abdicate its responsibility of taking care of the citizens' grievances. So that third tier is there. It's a largely invisible tier. And so by and large, things are working very well. And I think as times would grow, we would learn more. We're also trying to learn from what's happening in other countries. And if there are reasons or the factors which require us to do any tweaking, we'll do that.
Let me ask you specifically one area where I think there has been certain anxieties within the industry, right, on regulating fake news. And though fake news is a real problem, and we've seen that especially during the pandemic, just the avalanche of false information that was out there that the government and everyone in society was struggling with to make sure that we knew exactly what was happening, what is the right thing to do. So give us your perspective on, how should fake news be regulated? Are these anxieties, unfounded? What is the way forward on, regulating digital news content, especially in India?
I think that's a very, very relevant point, and the concerns of the industry are understandable. But just see it in a perspective. I mean, you mentioned that during COVID times, the role of fact-checking was very, very important, because all of us were totally unaware of the nuances of this disease, not only in India but abroad. And therefore, we required one forum where people could raise their queries, get their queries answered in terms of the impact and the effects of the disease. And it really helped both in, I think the Prasar Bharati did that, the PIB did that, even the states were also doing it, the Home Ministry was doing it, the Health Ministry was doing it. But Well, that is only one aspect of how we were trying to ensure that the correct information about the disease goes. But on a larger perspective, I think the IT rules which are proposed to be amended with the PIB fact check, if PIB fact checks a particular content and it says that it is fake, then that content should be pulled down or taken down by the intermediary platform. And that is from where all the apprehensions are stemming out. I can tell you that in the last few months, even White, you would not be aware. And only in the last 1 month, the PIB had fact-checked around 100 content which were there on certain YouTube channels. And YouTube itself pulled down 3 accounts on its own. We just sent them the details of those 3 accounts, which were blatantly fake news being spread. And they pulled down those 3 accounts. There were other 6 accounts where we fact-checked. All those content was taken down, and that is significant. All these accounts were demonetized. Now the problem is fake news or a bad content is taking place of good content. The viewership of a bad content is 10 times, 20 times more than a good content. That is the sad part. If we did block over 100 accounts through the blocking intermediary guidelines, including some about 35 to 40 Pakistan-based YouTube accounts, you could not imagine the amount of fake news or disturbing news which was there. So the fact that we had to do that was and all of them were having viewership running into crores and crores. So the tendency of using fake news to monetize your content and make money out of it as a profession, that is something which is very, very disturbing. So the limited point in the proposed IT rules, of course, it is there still for public consultation, is that, and PIB, what does the PIB fact check do? It only looks at decisions relating to the central government, doesn't look at any other aspect, not even the state government, not any other organization. And that is what PIB has been doing for the last 2 years. And if that is fact checked, if it is not pulled down from the platform, it remains floating, and people will continue to read that and believe what is fake to be true. So that is the logic. There should not be any apprehension on that point. Yeah.
Great. I think on that note, maybe we can open it up to the audience for questions.
Sir, my question is to Mr. Sahay.
If you could take the microphone.
Hi, I'm Shobna Bajaj from Warner Bros. Discovery. I was wondering if you could share your thoughts on, telco's demand for carriage fee to be paid by OTTs. I mean, of course, Korea likes to call it network usage fees, and EU likes to call it telco tax. But where does India stand?
I think we will not comment on that right now. There was a telecom bill which was there in public space. Some consultations are going on these OTT services, etc. So let's hold ourselves. Let us see what finally emerges. Yeah.
Any other questions?
But definitely, we can assure you that there is no intention of increasing the difficulty level and the stress level of the industry. There will be no such intention. Yeah.
Anyone? Okay. So I have a question to you as well, and in fact to all the panelists. Right. In the last few months, we've seen artificial intelligence take, the headlines across the globe. We have content which is generated by artificial intelligence. I don't think we've even fathomed what kind of challenges this is going to pose. So your thoughts on, what is the future of, content regulation, especially where the creator may not be a human, the creator may be an algorithm.
Yeah, I mean, see, AI or variant of AIs and how content can actually be in a way manipulated using AI is something very, very disturbing. We have heard about deepfakes as a major threat. It's still at a very nascent stage in India, but in other countries it's becoming a real problem. And it is something which we'll have to sit together to grapple, because we just cannot allow AI-based manipulation of content trying to proliferate ourselves in our country, with a huge population and with various type of psyches. That is something which is a big challenge, and we need to tackle it together. Yeah.
I think keeping aside the news bit of it, in terms of AI's ability, assuming AI is actually able to generate content in the entertainment space, which I'm sure it can. I mean, it's shown the propensity to, it's shown the ability to, but again, this is, I would consider an uneducated answer at this stage because I don't know enough. But I would imagine that it's still going to be limited by the amount of knowledge, input, and its own rules that have been set for it by someone. So to that extent, I would still imagine curated content to carry a lot more ability to, tell better stories, reimagine the world, whatever else it may be, which actually helps, a lot of storytelling make its mark in terms of content consumption and creation.
Mr. Khosla, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, just like Mihir said, I'm not very educated about the implications of artificial intelligence, but from whatever I have gathered knowledge about artificial intelligence, I probably have a contrarian view only on the capacity of AI to be implemented to generate content. I do believe that in the years to unfold in front of us, AI will become an important partner with the humans to create content. While to a great extent, creativity of a human being cannot be wholly replaced, but AI will be able to supplement and complement that capacity. And to that extent, of the projects that I know which are happening, I do believe that the time is not far when AI will play an active role in the media and entertainment industry.
One of the issues that we are seeing in multiple countries, especially in Australia, it started now. I think other countries in Europe also have taken it up, which is around big tech platforms and what is a fair revenue model for content creators. So, any thoughts? Is the government thinking about any intervention here?
No, I think this became quite a serious issue, and when the Australian law was enacted, and we also had a discussion with the legislature some time back. He was in India. I think there is already a matter before the Competition Commission on this issue, where the domestic news publishers have taken up this issue of an anti-competitive behavior because of the type of monopoly which these tech players have, especially in terms of the ad revenue. So let us look how the CCI takes it forward. But definitely it is a matter which all of us, including the government, would be concerned in terms of the content creators having an ample percentage of the revenue earning. That is definitely, we'll look at that.
So what would you like to see in the Digital India Act from the government? I mean, what is top of mind for you, as an OTT platform that you think the government should be doing?
So, I mean, I think we already alluded to the ideal framework that we spoke of, but essentially from what I understand, the Digital India Act is an overhaul of the IT Act, along with a few other ancillary issues thrown in. In that space, I think as long as we have the same bit of carriage content being demarcated, not being used with the same yardstick, measured by the same yardstick, and there are different rules around it, which naturally should be the case because their entire origin is different and therefore their treatment should be different. I think we land in a good space.
Anything from your end, Mr. Khosla, on what should be top of mind to the government that should be doing?
No, I think I echo the sentiments expressed by Mihir. Largely, this is going to overhaul the IT Act, which has been pending for quite a long period of time. The technology continues to evolve. Convergence, so to speak, I know Mihir said that convergence is probably not the right word and stands as a misnomer, but for the lack of better word that I could find, convergence is going to happen as more and more variants of technology are going to converge. It's going to raise complications in terms of how to segregate each segment of it. And I think the Digital Media Act should have the foresight of embedded evolving nature with these technologies which are yet to be unleashed for good order. And it should not only look at overhauling the IT Act and the IT rules, but also should look at some of the other ad hoc legislations, ad hoc self-regulations which have come into place, which were the need of that time. But they should subsume everything and should just act as more or less, as I said earlier, an umbrella act for the digital media sector.
Great. So your closing thoughts. What should the industry look forward to? What is your advice to the industry?
No, I think one would be fair to feel for the industry the type of transformational changes are taking place, especially with a new telecom bill, a new Digital India Act. So there could be apprehensions in terms of what's in store for us. But going by the way we have been able to grapple with issues and also trying to take the industry into confidence before we get into any aspect of legislation statute, there should not be any point of worry. In fact, the entire process is quite consultative, and I don't think at any point of time there would be any surprises in terms of the regulation or the statute. So that should be fine.
Great. I think very stimulating discussion, a lot of interesting points. Also, I think the sector is in a very interesting phase right now with a lot of creativity. I was just commenting some of the new shows that have come on OTT, which are produced in India, which are not dubbed, right? And these are international quality. So clearly, it's a great opportunity for India to become a powerhouse of digital creativity. And I hope the right regulatory environment will be created here. So not only are we created for India, but also we are creating for the world. Like the Prime Minister always says, make for the world. We become the content and innovation powerhouse that exports ideas across the globe. So on that note, I thank my fellow panelists and IAMAI for this opportunity. I think it was a great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, Ritesh, for joining us virtually.